Welcome to the Eagle of War. Here you will find the history of the past related to World War II. I wish you a good viewing. Don't forget to like and subscribe. On June 29, 1944, a German field marshal was asked how to stop the invasion. His answer was only 4 words long. And it ended his career. The summer of 1944 arrived not with hope, but with storms. Above Normandy, low clouds rolled in from the Atlantic, heavy and gray, pressing down on a battlefield already drowning in chaos. The beaches were no longer headlines. They were wounds, scarred sand, shattered concrete, and the quiet evidence of a landing that had succeeded. 25 days after D-Day, the Western Front was breaking. German bunkers lay cracked open like fossils, their guns twisted, their crews either dead, captured, or retreating inland on foot. Roads were choked with exhausted soldiers, mud on their boots, defeat in their eyes, moving east not by plan, but by instinct. Far from the front lines, in a world of maps and telephones, stood Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt. He was 70 years old. A veteran of 3 wars. A man who had commanded armies across Europe. Not a fanatic. Not a politician. A professional soldier, trained to see war as it is, not as it is wished to be. In late June, von Rundstedt was summoned to report on the situation in France. The maps told the story first. Red arrows, once confident and bold, were now tangled, bent backward, overlapping in retreat. Allied forces had secured their foothold. Air superiority was absolute. German reserves were bleeding away faster than they could be replaced. At the front, commanders like Rommel saw it clearly. Every day, Allied aircraft ruled the skies. Every movement in daylight invited destruction. The Atlantic Wall had failed. The invasion could no longer be contained. But in the inner chambers of the German High Command, reality moved more slowly. There, optimism was still expected. Faith still demanded. Truth, dangerous. When von Rundstedt was asked what should be done to stop the Allies, the room fell silent. He did not raise his voice. He did not dramatize. He simply spoke the truth. 4 words. Make peace, you fools. The line went dead. In that moment, decades of service ended. Not because he was wrong, but because he was honest. This was not merely a military assessment. It was an admission that the war in the West was lost. That no counterattack, no reshuffling of divisions, no speeches from Berlin could undo what had already happened on the beaches of Normandy. And honesty, in Hitler's Germany, was unforgivable. As storm clouds gathered over France, von Rundstedt's warning echoed unanswered through corridors of power, while millions more lives still hung in the balance. In the next part, the conflict between frontline reality and political fantasy deepens, and the cost of denial becomes catastrophic. By early July, the war in France no longer resembled the plans drawn in Berlin. Along the Norman countryside, hedgerows became killing grounds. Every field concealed Allied infantry. Every road was watched from the air. German units moved only at night, and even then, they moved blind. At the front, Field Marshal Rommel no longer spoke in theory. He walked the lines himself. Rommel saw shattered armor burned out along narrow lanes. He spoke with junior officers commanding fragments of divisions that existed now only on paper. Ammunition was short. Fuel was worse. Replacement troops arrived untrained, terrified, and already marked for death. Above all, Rommel understood one brutal fact. The Allies controlled the sky. Every daylight movement triggered fighter bombers. Columns dissolved before reaching the front. Reinforcements died before they could fight. The battlefield belonged to Allied pilots as much as to Allied generals. Rommel reported this reality upward, again and again. He warned that Normandy was no longer a containment battle. It was a slow strangulation. Unless Germany withdrew, regrouped, and accepted the political consequences, the Western Front would collapse entirely. But his reports met resistance. Not at the front, but far behind it. In distant headquarters, officers studied maps untouched by smoke or blood. They spoke of decisive counterattacks, of secret weapons, of divisions that no longer existed in fighting strength. They demanded optimism. Rommel and von Rundstedt demanded realism. The disagreement became a quiet war of its own, frontline commanders versus ideology. When Rommel requested permission to pull back and save what remained of the army, the answer came back delayed, diluted, and conditional. Hitler alone would decide. And Hitler was hundreds of miles away, insulated from the sound of artillery. Every day of delay cost thousands of lives. Meanwhile, Allied forces expanded their bridgehead. Town by town, road by road, they pushed inward. German lines bent, then snapped, then reformed farther east, each time weaker than before. Inside the German command structure, fear replaced clarity. To admit defeat was treason. To tell the truth was career suicide. To act without approval was rebellion. Rommel grew increasingly isolated. Von Rundstedt was already sidelined. And in Berlin, something darker was taking shape. Among officers who saw the inevitable coming, whispers began to spread, dangerous ones. If the war could not be won militarily, perhaps it could be ended politically. If Hitler refused to listen, perhaps he could be removed. The battlefield was collapsing. The chain of command was fracturing. And Germany stood on the edge of an internal explosion. By the summer of 1944, some German officers no longer asked how to win the war. They asked how to end it, even if it meant killing their own leader. The front in Normandy was unraveling, but the most dangerous battlefield now lay far from France. It was inside Germany itself. As Allied forces pushed deeper into Europe, a small circle of officers and civilians reached the same conclusion as von Rundstedt and Rommel: the war was lost. Every additional month meant only destruction, of cities, of armies, of Germany itself. For them, loyalty to the state had replaced loyalty to the man. On July 20, 1944, that belief turned into action. Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, a wounded veteran of the Eastern Front, entered the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's heavily guarded headquarters in East Prussia. In his briefcase sat a bomb powerful enough to end the regime in a single moment. At the front, nothing moved. In Berlin, everything held its breath. The explosion came shortly after noon. Walls shook. Windows shattered. Smoke filled the conference room. For a moment, history stood still. But fate, like the war itself, refused to end cleanly. Hitler survived. And within hours, the conspiracy collapsed. What followed was not justice, but terror. Arrests swept through the officer corps. Confessions were beaten out. Trials were staged. Executions were filmed. The message was unmistakable: doubt was treason, and realism was betrayal. Rommel, already wounded and sidelined after an air attack in Normandy, was drawn into the shadow of suspicion. His honesty, his warnings, his refusal to lie had made him dangerous. Von Rundstedt, though not involved, understood the meaning immediately. The last chance to end the war from within was gone. From that day forward, the conflict was no longer about strategy. It was about obedience. Commanders stopped speaking freely. Reports softened. Reality was edited before reaching Hitler's desk. The truth, already unwelcome, was now lethal. The Western Front would continue to collapse. The Eastern Front would grind forward. And Germany would fight on, not because it could win, but because no one was allowed to say it could not. For honest words had once silenced a room. Now, silence ruled an empire. By late summer, 1944, the Western Front no longer obeyed commands. It obeyed physics, fuel, and time. After the failed assassination attempt, the German army fought on under a new rule: do not think, only comply. Reports became careful. Language softened. Losses were described as temporary setbacks. Retreats were renamed planned adjustments. Reality disappeared somewhere between the front line and Hitler's desk. In France, Allied forces broke free of Normandy. Operation Cobra shattered what remained of German cohesion. Entire formations dissolved in days. The countryside filled with wrecked armor, abandoned guns, and columns of prisoners marching west under Allied guard. German commanders knew what was happening. They also knew they could no longer say it. Without honest assessments, decisions grew worse. Counterattacks were ordered without fuel. Divisions were shifted on maps faster than men could move on roads destroyed by bombing. Air support was promised that no longer existed. The war became an exercise in fiction. Field Marshal von Rundstedt watched from the sidelines, his role reduced, his warning long ignored. He had not betrayed the Reich, he had understood it too well. And for that, he had been removed at the moment his experience mattered most. Rommel did not live to see the end. In October, after being linked, rightly or wrongly, to the July conspiracy, he was given a choice, a public trial that would endanger his family, or a quiet death that would preserve his honor. He chose the latter. Germany lost not just a commander, but a voice willing to speak truth from the front. As autumn turned to winter, the cost of silence multiplied. Allied armies crossed France, entered Belgium, and pushed toward the German border. Cities burned. Civilians fled west and east alike. The Ardennes offensive, launched in desperation, briefly shocked the Allies, but only accelerated Germany's final exhaustion. It was the last illusion of control. By early 1945, everything von Rundstedt had warned about had come to pass. The Western Front collapsed into the heart of Germany. The Eastern Front crushed inward from the other side. The Reich was being compressed from both directions, exactly as the professional soldiers had predicted months earlier. In April, Hitler took his own life in a bunker beneath a ruined city. The war ended weeks later. Von Rundstedt survived, captured by Allied forces, alive, but vindicated too late to matter. His 4 words, spoken in frustration and clarity, had not changed the course of the war. But they had revealed it. This was not a story of treason. It was a story of truth rejected. Of warnings silenced. Of lives lost because honesty arrived before permission. History would remember the battles, the dates, the victories. But behind them stands a quieter lesson. When leaders refuse reality, reality does not negotiate. It only waits. History often turns on speeches and battles. But sometimes, it turns on 4 words that no one wanted to hear. By the time the war in Europe ended, more than 50 million people were dead. Cities lay in ruins. Nations were exhausted. And the men who had once believed they could shape history were either buried, disgraced, or silent. Among them was Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt. He had not led a rebellion. He had not planted a bomb. He had not betrayed his oath. He had simply answered a question honestly. When asked how to stop the Allied invasion, von Rundstedt did not offer fantasies. He did not ask for more divisions, more time, or more faith. He spoke from experience earned across a lifetime of war. Make peace, you fools. Those 4 words were not defeatism. They were strategy, spoken too late, to men who no longer recognized it. After the war, the truth became undeniable. Germany never regained the initiative in the West. Air superiority was never challenged. Normandy was never reversed. Every month of continued fighting only guaranteed greater destruction. Von Rundstedt had seen the ending while others still argued over the middle. His fate reflected a broader tragedy of the Second World War, the systematic removal of professionals in favor of obedience. As honest commanders were silenced, replaced, or killed, decisions grew detached from reality, and the war became unwinnable long before it officially ended. Rommel's death. The failure of July 20th. The collapse of the fronts. All were chapters of the same story. A regime that punished truth could only move toward catastrophe. Today, von Rundstedt is rarely remembered for those 4 words. Yet they stand as one of the most accurate assessments of the war ever spoken inside the Third Reich. They remind us that courage is not always loud. Sometimes, it is calm. Sometimes, it is unwelcome. And sometimes, it costs everything. This is not just a story about Germany in 1944. It is a warning that echoes far beyond it. When power demands illusion. When honesty becomes dangerous. And when leaders choose belief over reality. The outcome is already decided. The war may continue. Long after the guns fell silent, one unanswered warning remained, ignored not because it was wrong, but because it was inconvenient. The war in Europe ended in May 1945, but its lessons did not arrive with the surrender. They arrived slowly, through documents, testimonies, and the quiet realization that many of the war's most catastrophic decisions had not been forced by circumstance, but chosen in denial. In Allied captivity, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt was questioned not as a criminal, but as a witness. He had commanded vast armies, yet what interested his interrogators most was not how he fought, but what he had understood. Again and again, the same pattern emerged. The German army had not collapsed from lack of courage. It had collapsed from the absence of truth. By 1944, the outcome in the West was mathematically unavoidable. Allied industrial power, air supremacy, and manpower had reached a level Germany could not match. No tactical brilliance could reverse it. No single battle could restore the initiative. And yet the war continued. Why? Because accurate reports were filtered. Because officers learned which words ended careers, and which preserved them. Because the system rewarded loyalty to belief, not loyalty to reality. Von Rundstedt's 4 words exposed that system in a single sentence. They were not emotional. They were not ideological. They were professional. That was their danger. After the July 20th plot failed, the last barriers to fantasy collapsed. Hitler trusted only those who agreed with him. Commanders were chosen not for competence, but for compliance. Decisions became increasingly detached from conditions on the ground. The Ardennes offensive was one such decision. Launched in the winter of 1944, it gambled Germany's remaining reserves on surprise and weather. For a moment, it shocked the Allies. But even as tanks pushed forward through snow-covered forests, the outcome was already sealed. Fuel ran out. Air superiority returned. Losses could not be replaced. The offensive did not change the war, it only shortened what remained of Germany's future. As Allied forces crossed the Rhine and Soviet armies closed in from the east, the consequences of months of denial became unavoidable. Cities were flattened. Refugee columns stretched for miles. The army that might have withdrawn and surrendered earlier now fought among its own civilians. This was the final cost of ignoring reality when it first appeared. Von Rundstedt lived to see it all. He survived the regime that discarded him, the war that proved him right, and the ideology that demanded silence. His legacy is not found in victories or medals, but in a moment of clarity at the edge of collapse. History often celebrates those who act. Less often does it remember those who warn. Yet warnings are where outcomes are decided. The story of 1944 is not merely about Germany's defeat. It is about how institutions fail when honesty becomes unacceptable, and how catastrophe follows predictably, relentlessly, and without mercy. Von Rundstedt's career ended with 4 words. But their meaning has outlived the war itself. They remind us that truth does not need permission to be real. And when leaders refuse to hear it, history ensures they will learn it the hardest way possible. The most dangerous moment in history is not when leaders make mistakes, but when they can no longer hear the truth. When the war finally ended, silence replaced gunfire. Across Europe, cities stood broken, their ruins answering questions no tribunal ever could. The outcome that had been visible in the summer of 1944 had arrived exactly as predicted, late, costly, and unavoidable. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt faded from the headlines of history. He did not stand on victory podiums. He did not write manifestos. He left behind no dramatic last stand. He left behind a warning. His 4 words did not change the war, but they explained it. They revealed a system in which reality became an enemy, honesty became treason, and professional judgment was sacrificed to ideology. By the time the truth was undeniable, it no longer mattered. Rommel's empty command. The failed resistance. The shattered fronts. These were not isolated tragedies. They were symptoms. In the end, the Third Reich did not fall because it lacked soldiers or weapons. It fell because it rejected information that contradicted belief. The war continued not because it could be won, but because no one was allowed to say it was lost. This is why the summer of 1944 matters. It was the moment when the future was known, but ignored. History often focuses on turning points we can see: invasions, assassinations, surrenders. But the real turning point came earlier, in a quiet conversation, when a seasoned commander answered honestly and was punished for it. That moment did not end the war. It sealed its ending. The lesson is not confined to one nation, one leader, or one era. Whenever power demands certainty instead of truth. Whenever leaders surround themselves with agreement instead of accuracy. And whenever warnings are silenced for being inconvenient. The outcome is already written. The war may continue. The speeches may grow louder. The illusions may hold, for a time. But history does not argue. It waits. And when it finally speaks, it does so in consequences. End. Don't forget to like and subscribe.